Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to have as a guest today Mr. Michael Malice, an author, columnist, and media personality. He was the subject of the graphic novel Ego and Hubris by the late Harvey Pekar of American Splendor fame. He's the author of Dear Reader, the unauthorized autobiography of Kim Jong-il, 2014, as well as The New Right, 2019, a book that I've been reading deeply this week that was reminiscent to me of the new journalism anthropology of Tom Wolfe. He's the co-author of 7 additional books, including Made in America, the New York Times best-selling autobiography of UFC Hall of Famer Matt Hughes, Concierge Confidential with Michael Fazio, 2011, which was one of NPR's top 5 celebrity books of the year, and most recently, 2016, Black Man, White House, comedian D.L. Hughley's satirical look at the Obama years, also an NYT bestseller. He served as a cultural and political commentator on podcasts with Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, my daughter, Michaela Peterson, twice, and has his own YouTube channel and podcast, You're Welcome. My producer put a note at the bottom of this autobiography. Michael is a comedian with a harsh and fast sense of humor. He's a big fan of yours, but be prepared for a little bit of crazy. I got that impression reading your book, but in the best possible way, I would say. So let's talk about The New Right, if you don't mind. I'd like to dive right into that. So I said in the intro that it was reminiscent to me of the new journalism of the 1960s. When I first read The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which I would recommend to everyone as a brilliant journalistic anthropological investigation into what became the psychedelic culture in the early 1960s. It's a brilliant book. And I got the sense that in The New Right, you were doing much of the same thing for whatever it was that was happening from the time of maybe 2013 to 2016, something like that. Something that actually seems like history already, interestingly enough. And you talk about, from an insider's perspective in some sense, because you were an insider and an outsider at the same time in these groups, but you talk a lot about 4chan and memes and all these subcultures that exist online that are major forces and social domains in their own right, but that are, if not ignored completely by the mainstream media, so to speak, consistently misunderstood. And so, but then by the same, so I'd like to ask you about that. We could start with 4chan maybe, and maybe you could walk us through first what it is, and then what it was, and then what it is now, if it's anything, because I did get the sense as well that this happened already. Something else is happening now, and I don't know what it is, but whatever it was you were writing about, that's 5 years ago, which is a long time in internet terms.
Sure. I think right now, first of all, discussing 4chan publicly in a context like this, in some kind of studious or serious context, violates the ethos of 4chan. One of the big rules about 4chan is, normies get out, So by talking about it automatically, I'm kind of positing myself as someone who's an outsider. I'm not on 4chan all the time. But 4chan is kind of emblematic of a broader section of the internet, which wasn't literally only 4chan, but was driven by irreverency, was driven by this idea of that which is presented to us with earnestness should not be taken at face value, that this earnestness is often used as a cudgel and as a mechanism of affecting social control. Certainly you've been the subject of many memes, I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes.
But, and the point that they figured out, there's an expression that they say, meme magic is real. The premise being, before The New Right, the idea was you'd have these organizations putting forth some kind of claim or idea, often absurd on its face. And the argument would be like, well, that's not accurate, that's not fair. And the new approach was, why are we taking this agitprop at face value instead of mocking it, clowning it, and basically rendering the tool impotent? So that was kind of 4chan's poll board. You had the Donald subreddit on Reddit. So there is this but you say that it's misunderstood by the mainstream press. I always use the term corporate press because I don't really regard it as mainstream. But I don't know that it's misunderstood so much as misrepresented.
Well, I think it's probably both, because it's not easy. First of all, there's an immense divide between people who don't use the internet as a social mechanism or as their primary source of information, and people who do. There's an unbelievable divide. And maybe if you're older than 50, you're in the world of 1970. And if you're younger than 40, you're in the world of 2010. And those are really different worlds. I mean, you talk about the corporate press, and I've been thinking a lot about the technological impact of YouTube and podcasts. So, and this is why I'd like to dig into the misunderstood part first before we go to the misrepresented part. What I saw popping up in your book continually was two things happening in 4chan. There's troublemaking that in some sense is there for its own sake. And I'd like to talk to you about that. There's a political movement, but then there's also this exploration of what is actually a technological revolution. So you think about legacy media. So I've noticed that when I've gone to TV stations and been interviewed by a journalist, I'll have a discussion with the journalist in the green room, and I'm talking to a person then. But as soon as the cameras go on, I'm not talking to a person anymore. I'm talking to someone who's an adept mouthpiece for a massive corporate organization. But that was actually a necessity, because the bandwidth for television was so expensive that it wasn't possible to grant any individual untrammeled access to it. And so it was inevitable that a corporation was never going to allow, except in exceptional cases, any journalist to have what would truly be an individual opinion, and certainly wasn't going to let them explore ideas in real time. Too expensive, too risky. But then now we're in this weird situation, and the 4chan guys were playing with this to some degree, where it isn't obvious that the corporate media platforms have any advantage whatsoever over anyone who's technologically able. I mean, the fact that we can have this discussion, for example. So
they do have one.
Go ahead.
I would say they have one very big advantage, which you've seen yourself, which is the concept of legitimacy. So your previous book, the New York Times refused to basically acknowledge it as being printed in America. So you can't say it's a New York Times bestseller, even though the number it sold is just, a huge amount, is hugely successful, right? So the Dear Reader, the book I did about North Korea, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, I did that with Kickstarter. As a result of that, on Amazon, it looks the same. It's going to have a page listing like another page listing. But the New York Times, all these other elements, they're in a position. I got an hour on C-SPAN's Book TV, so that is changing in that regard. But it gives them an opportunity to pretend that this book doesn't exist. So unless a book is being published by certain outlets that have legitimacy, basically it's just like, I don't know if you watched wrestling growing up. I certainly did. The WWF, when I was a kid, there were rival organizations, and they literally acted as if these rival organizations didn't exist. And if a wrestler came over from the NWA to the WWF, they acted like he was this new discovery, that he had no history to him. It was very odd, because all you had to do was change the channel, and they're acting in certain other mechanisms. So that is a big advantage, because if you go to talk to mom and you say, "Where'd you hear this? I heard this on CBS. Where'd you hear this? I heard this on 4chan." It's very clear which one mom is going to choose.
No, I agree. But part of what the 4chan guys were doing, by your own account, to some degree, was testing these new technological platforms to see how much power they actually had. So these trolling games that you described, so you described trolling as something that's actually quite specific in its intent, when it isn't just being, say, adolescent foolishness. It's something like, can we create a narrative and string along legacy media types? And some of that's a joke, but some of it's also a test. Is like, does this new technological platform have enough power to bend and twist what has been the standard means of delivering the cultural narrative for decades? And the answer to that frequently was yes. And increasingly, the legacy media outlets are suffering from delegitimization. They lose money,
Yes.
they lose their ability to fact check, and because they don't have this technological advantage anymore, they have the remnants of their brand. It's something like that.
Yeah. And there's also there's a very big asymmetry between honesty and dishonesty, right? If you and I are good friends and I tell you one major lie, well, that's one statement out of tens of thousands. That one statement is still going to do much more damage than one honest statement because I've lost, there's an amount of trust lost. So their brand has been, and they say this explicitly. CNN had ads not that long ago saying, "This is an Apple. We only report facts." If I'm coming at you and saying that I am only reporting facts, as soon as I'm caught in one misrepresentation, even if it's innocent, which I don't think it is in most cases, right away, that just kind of collapses the souffle because I trusted you, I relied on you, and now you're giving me misinformation. But most importantly, and this is where I differ from more mainstream conservatives who think things have become corrupted. You've made mistakes. I've made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes all the time. It's going to be inevitable simply from a lack of knowledge. What steps have you taken once these mistakes have been made to make amends and also put yourself in a position that you won't make the same mistake again? And if you see with corporate media, oftentimes they'll do things that are disingenuous, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's just say they were sloppy, but no one gets fired. There's no mea culpa. Like, you know what? Like Tylenol is a great counterexample. Back in the early 80s, I believe it was, Tylenol someone was poisoning Tylenol bottles. People, I think, were dying, or at the very least were getting very sick. So Tylenol had this huge ad campaign that said, "This is the steps we've taken. You got the childproof calf, you got the seal, you got the cotton, whatever it was. This is how you know that we are safe. You can rely on Tylenol." You don't see that with CNN or Fox or ABC. Whenever they do these egregious things, they just pretend that they never happened all along, or say that this is some kind of, you can't listen to the conspiracy theories on the internet. So this is why there's this kind of another loss of trust, because there seems to be very little effort to maintain and foster that trusting relationship between the channels and the audience, and make amends when things have gone wrong.
So, I want to continue with 4chan for a bit. Can you walk me through exactly, like you said that one of the mistakes that CNN made, for example, and also Hillary Clinton's campaign, was treating 4chan like it was actually a person and as if there was someone who could represent it and speak. Can you lay out exactly what it is and how it works? And then maybe we can talk about the meme culture that's associated with it.
Sure. So 4chan, and there's others. There's 8chan, there's the Reddit and other such. They're message boards. So basically, 4chan, I don't remember how many boards they have. Some are completely innocuous. So fitness is their fitness and health board. FA is their fashion board. Guys can ask, do these pants look good on me? What kind of hat would look good with my hair? Innocuous stuff. POL is their politics board. So basically, it's anonymous, and it's not, I believe, after there's 15 pages, and after there's no updates on a thread, the threads vanish into the netherworld, whatever. You can't see them anymore.
Right, so it's got an impermanence.
Correct. Mm-hmm. You can identify yourself with the flag if you want when you log in, but there's no usernames. It's not like Facebook. So basically, the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2015, 2016 were positing about these sites and like, how is it that this is allowed to happen? But it's not the kind of thing where it's like Facebook and you call Mark Zuckerberg and he bans certain users. The users are ephemeral. You don't know who they are. It's the posts are ephemeral. They just vanish off the board. So this claim that, the comparison I had, I believe in the book, was kind of more Al-Qaeda. It's very decentralized. Mm-hmm. You can't really take out one person and then the whole thing falls apart, other than you having to try to take out the site, which they tried to do earlier this year and in late 2020. But it's an entirely different model. And I think people who have that bureaucratic mindset, people who have that elitist in the sense that you have this managerial elite running things, they can't even conceive of an organization or a location or a website which is decentralized and there's no big bad vampire to kill once you take out this vampire.
Yeah, but that is part of what I thought was, in some sense, you're documenting something that's so revolutionary that even the people using it don't know how revolutionary it is. And so because we have these massive communication technologies now, and they all have slightly different rules. And just by tweaking the rules a tiny bit, you can create a whole new organization, like TikTok, let's say, which has videos of a certain length and at least to begin with, almost no other. It's all of a sudden that's a huge social network doing all sorts of things that no one has ever done before. So the rules for 4chan are really crucially important to understanding it. So it's anonymous, decentralized, and evanescent. And
yes,
that's
and
something...
also, yeah, and they have the two rules are no child pornography, and if there's pornography, it has to stick to the pornography board. But so it's pretty much the Wild West when it comes to free speech.
Right, and the fact that it's not permanent also, so it's anonymized and impermanent, which means you'd think, at least in part, that it would encourage a lot more risk-taking, because one of the things that would mitigate risk is the fact that it could be attributed to you, but also that it would be permanent.
Yeah, that's the comparison of 4chan and, let's say, Twitter, where, someone's old tweets will be there. At the very least, they're going to be archived somewhere. You're going to have a consistent username. So even if it's not Jordan Peterson, if you're just going to be like Jack Smith, 37, they'll be able to track Jack Smith 37's posts over time. You can't really do that on a site like 4chan or 8chan. But there's other sites like this. What they have figured out is, the corporate press might decide 4chan's the devil, 4chan's the devil, 4chan's the devil. You take down 4chan, well, they'll just go to Discord, or they'll go to all these other sites. So technology is what allows people, is designed in contemporary terms for people to communicate. So if you're going to kind of take out one location where they're gathering and trying to communicate, it's going to take minutes to find a new location. Now, there's going to be a cost because you have to get the word out through other means about this is where we all are now. But it's very, very hard when people are basically effectively teleporting, right? For me to go from one location to another physically, I have to get in a plane, a car, or a train, whatever. But if you go to one website to another, I have to type in a web address. So if you just ban one address, the amount of effort it takes to shift to another one could not be more minimal.
So you documented, so no one's in charge of this, but something happens, and it's a communication network, and it attracts people who, It attracts people who are communicating in a like-minded way across time. Why did it become a place that was dominated, at least by your observations, by the thought that was associated with the new right? Why did it converge on that?
Because 4chan historically has been a site for great irreverence. So they had campaigns to troll. And by trolling, let me say specifically what I mean. Trolling it's not just, you have a Twitter account and I say, @Jordan Peterson, you're a jerk, F off. That's not trolling. That's just being obnoxious. Trolling, I regard the first troll as Andy Kaufman, the comedian, where by your performance, you're turning a third party by exploiting their weaknesses into an unwitting performer on their own. For example, there was a great wrestler, to bring it back to wrestling, called the Honky Tonk Man from the 80s. And his shtick was he was an Elvis impersonator, right? And when they interviewed him, he would say, "Oh no, Elvis stole my act." Now, Elvis had been dead for 15 years at that time. It makes no sense whatsoever, but this would get the audience really enraged and they'd flip out. So when you are calmly causing someone else to have an extreme reaction, and in this case, and good trolling, he's exploiting their innocence and naivete. I mean, they're taking what he's saying at face value, even though it's a complete absurdity, and what follows suit, on some case can be put in their lap. So they used to, what 4chan would be known for is, for example, you had a Mountain Dew, right? And they had named the next flavor of Mountain Dew. It's just a corporate mechanism. I talk about this in the book. It's a corporate mechanism to sell, your sugary soft drink. What name should we call it? And they basically got enough people together, and this is kind of like rent seeking, right? If you have an organized goal-seeking minority as opposed to an indifferent majority, that organized goal-seeking minority is going to be able to punch very much above its weight in terms of getting the achievements it wants. How many people are caring about this Mountain Dew poll? Very, very few, other than the trolls. So they got the number one result to be Hitler did nothing wrong, right? Now, they're not Nazis. They don't think the Holocaust is something that didn't happen or is bad. They're putting now this Mountain Dew, who's trying to use this fun to sell you this poisonous sugary garbage. Now the corporation is in position. Are they going to follow through with this poll, or are they going to pull it? Whatever they choose, they have been forced into making a choice that they themselves would not have wanted, because you have someone in a meeting trying to, hey, this is going to be fun for the kids. And they ended up pulling the poll because they're like, okay, the internet won. So to go from that and this kind of extreme distrust, if not contempt, for corporate irreverence and corporate humor and corporate fun, to have basically, can I curse on this?
You can do whatever you want.
Okay, well, not everything. So to have someone who was basically a shit poster on Twitter running for president, who was just there in these debates, insulting these politicians to their face in often very below the belt terms, that was that ethos brought to life, because no one could have imagined in decades that you would have a presidential contender who's looking at a sitting senator in the face, who's doing well in the polls, and telling that senator, I've never made fun of your looks, and there's plenty of material there. Believe me, that much I can tell you. You know, this is something that was completely unprecedented and new. And we've been taught for decades that, you know, politics should be about respect. These are tough choices. These are people's lives. That's all very true. But there's this very new left from the late 60s perspective idea that these kind of powerful entities use respect and decorum and decency as a mechanism to stifle dissent and to basically make their victory a fait accompli. And if you kind of mess that up and force them to show their hand that these are not kind, caring people who care about your grandma in your neighborhood, these are power-hungry sociopaths who will smile at your face and do whatever they need to when the lights are off, that I think was something that was very useful in terms of exposing our politics for what they are.
So it struck me over the last decade or so that the alignment of comedic satire with right-wing philosophy or political philosophy or views was something that was completely unprecedented. I thought, well, all of a sudden the right wing are the jesters, or at least among the right wing are these jesters. And I really didn't know what to make of that. I mean, you seem to regard it in your book, The New Right, you seem to regard it as a kind of right-wing anarchic rebellion against, but it's strange what they're against, because on the one hand, there's the corporate voice, let's say, that characterizes the media, and on the other hand, there's the left-wing progressives, and you can't really put them in the same camp all that easily.
Well, hopefully we will be putting them in the same camp. But they are in the same camp because one of my quotes is, conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit. So much of conservatism, Buckley got his start, William F. Buckley, who's I think the big villain of the book, got his start complaining how terrible things are and how mistreated he was at Yale. The new right perspective isn't complaining about how things are at Yale. It's let's send tanks to Harvard Yard and raze it to the ground. So these are two different approaches. And much of conservatism for decades, besides being inherently humorless, which is a personality thing, which is perfectly fine if that's your thing, it has been about a reaction. So the left would have some idea of the moment, we need to do this and that. The right would just dig in their heels, get dragged along, and it's a ratchet effect constantly moving us toward a more and more progressive society. The National Review's slogan was standing athwart history, yelling stop. And then at a certain point, people realized, how about instead of yelling, we actually stop it? How about we actually try to put a wrench into these gears? How about we try to, metaphorically tar and feather some of these people instead of just complaining that it's not fair? Let's be aggressive and let's take the fight to them.
Okay, and you clearly see an analog between the tricks that Trump used, let's say the humorous tricks that he used, and the manner in which he appealed to the public, and whatever was going on in places like 4chan and on Reddit, and with memes as well. And you spend a lot of time in your book talking about Pepe, for example. So yeah. What is it that you see as the connection? I mean, look, I saw this T-shirt in Florida last year that I thought was really apropos. It said, Trump 2020 because fuck you twice.
Yeah.
And I thought, yes, there's something about that that's really interesting. And I've talked to my progressive friends about this a lot. And because I'm trying to figure out exactly what's going on and being appalled, at least to some degree, at the shenanigans of the Democrats, among others, especially the identity politics types. Because,
yes.
Look, I'll tell you what I see in relationship to my books, for example. So, hypothetically, this is the standard legacy media critique of my books. I would say, is that I'm peddling nonsense that, if not trite, is outright dangerous, and which is kind of a strange combination, to ne'er-do-wells who are so far beneath contempt that any attempt to help them is to be met with suspicion. And that's something that really puzzles me, because when I meet the people that I'm communicating with, when I walk around or when I go to my lectures, I see individuals, because I look at individuals, I see individuals who are trying to get their houses in order, who are often in desperate straits. And they come up to me and tell me, some step they've taken towards improvement, sort of shamefacedly, but also happy about it. And, I'm very happy that that's happening and tell them that. And that's my experience. But then I see in the response to my hypothetical audience, which is a misrepresentation to begin with, a contempt that's so deep that the contempt is even there for the attempt to help. And then I think, well, you progressive types, at least in principle, you're all for the downtrodden. But I don't know what it is. Maybe if they stay in their place and act like they're supposed to, or there's this contempt among the helping class, let's say, for those they're hypothetically helping, that's so deep that, and I think it destroyed Hillary Clinton's campaign, that contempt. Her comments about the basket of deplorables and the Democrat abandonment of the working class, and Trump tapped into that somehow, and you draw connections, and so I'd like you to elaborate on that a little bit, if you would.
Sure. And whenever I try to talk about people, I always try to steelman their arguments and present them in the most strong position possible. When the left is at its best, it's as you mentioned, it is about concerning about marginalized people who are forgotten. The far left, historically would care about prisoners' rights and how bad it is that this prisoner is treated. For most people, it's kind of like lock him up, throw away the key. And that's kind of a left-wing idea that, like, this guy's been forgotten. Let's make sure he has food. He's not being, assaulted on a daily basis, things like that. So they understand also in other contexts that when you have young males who have nothing to lose, who are completely marginalized, who are spat on and called every name in the book, in other contexts, whether the Middle East, in inner city, they realized you keep pushing someone at the bottom and keep telling him you're nothing, you deserve to have nothing. That young male is going to, at the very least, try to get some kind of modicum of respect, try to get some modicum of status. And this often has literally very violent consequences, because if I have nothing to lose, but I can make a name for myself, or I could for 5 minutes have a sense of power, some people are going to do that arithmetic, and it's a very, very bad thing. And this is, broadly speaking,
everyone will do that arithmetic virtually as unfair inequality multiplies. That just becomes more and more likely, that response. So,
but to your point is, so in other contexts, I understand this, but now we're talking about your audience, right? These are young men who aren't doing so hot, and now they're being told they don't have a girlfriend. They desperately want to have a girlfriend, and now they're told you're a loser for not having a girlfriend. It's like, well, I'm trying to get out of that situation. I'm not trying to be some kind of date rapist. I'm not trying to be some sexual predator. I just want to be normal. I just want to have Maslow's hierarchy of needs met. But because they have been assigned to be, you're supposed to be here at the bottom, you've had your turn, you're the whipping boy of the moment, on an individual level, this is going to have very deleterious consequences. And because you are telling them, listen, you don't have to be even if you're going to be at the bottom, you could still be a better person tomorrow than you are today. Well, now you're kind of going to their house and rearranging their furniture and messing up their schemes. So of course, they're going to react in very aggressive ways towards your teachings, I think.
Well, it's funny too, because that notion of my audience is a caricature to begin with, but I don't care about that in some sense. I'm interested that the caricaturing is occurring. It's like there's a reason for it. Why? They're all male, they're all angry, they're all white. It's like, no, that's not right. And even if they do skew male, that's at least in part a legacy hangover from the fact that most of the people who watch YouTube are male. But anyways, nonetheless, that's the categorization. But then there's the emergence of that contempt. And I think, well, that is driving, just as you pointed out there, that insistence upon the despicableness of that status is driving. I could see that in the 4chan in the writing about 4chan that you were doing. That's that there's a testing and a pushing back that's going on there. And some of it is clowning and some of it is like pointless troublemaking as far as I'm concerned. But there's more going on in there than that, and that's for sure. So, and then it coalesces around these more right-wing ideas, which I also find somewhat surprising. And so what do you make of that exactly? Is it because those ideas are the ones that are most specifically forbidden, or and the satirical, comic, rebellious types just glom onto them for that? Or what do you think it is?
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's that if you tell someone who's got nothing going on and you say, if you push this button right here, it's going to have some really hilarious consequences for some people who think they're better than you and have no problem telling you to your face they're better than you, a lot of people are going to push that button, especially when the results are often hilarious. So it is going to give them that sense of power. And I don't know that they're making the wrong choice. I don't think it's very useful to tell someone who's not really being particularly aggressive that, you suck and you're terrible. And that, you know what it is? Like, I don't make fun of people for being overweight. Like, I go after people for a lot of things. I don't go after people who are going overweight. I had a friend who passed away because he had morbid obesity. I had another friend who had a gastric bypass. Because when you make fun of someone who's overweight, you're making fun of all your friends who are overweight. They're seeing it as well. And here's the thing. That person knows they're overweight. They know they're going to be treated differently. They know they're going to be, looked down on and all these other things. They're painfully aware. And it's the same thing here. If someone is marginalized and you're calling him a loser, he knows he's a loser. At that point, it just becomes a bit of cruelty and bullying. And also, anytime you try to tell someone, especially in America or in the West at least, to sit down and shut up, it's like, who are you to tell me to sit down and shut up? Because now you don't have the power to tell me to sit down and shut up. You had that power in school. You have that power in the office. Maybe you had that power when there were 3 networks. Now that there's infinite networks, if you look at the internet, you can't silence me. So I am going to talk. And if I see that it's upsetting you and you hate me, even though you don't know me, yeah, it's going to be of value for me to upset you because I do think you're a bad actor, I think is the mindset. And I don't think that mindset's at all irrational.
So let's dig into that a little bit. I mean, I got memed like mad when I first rose to whatever prominence I've risen to or notoriety or whatever. There were memes, and I think that's probably still the case. There were memes being generated in the hundreds, like weekly. It was crazy. And I was watching them and I thought, if I behave myself properly, those won't get unbearably cruel.
Okay.
I thought if I can take a joke, then they're going to tilt in a manner that's more positive rather than more negative. Because I could see that there was a testing going on there. Sure. that these jokes were being pushed at me, and I suppose to some degree pushed at whoever was listening to me. And
right.
And had I responded negatively to that in any... I remember when I worked on working crews, that one of the things that almost always happened was that when someone new joined a crew, there'd be a test period where, various forms of insults and
Sure.
would be hurled at them. And it was an attempt to see how they responded. And if they responded with good humor and accepted their stupid nickname with some good grace and could laugh about it, maybe could say something funny in return, then, after a week or two, if they did their job, then everybody accepted them and away they went. But if they got all uptight about it and angry, then it just got meaner and meaner until they were driven off. And I could see that happening with the memes. And, I was compared to Kermit the Frog, for example, and that sort of morphed into a peppy thing. And I was watching that and hopefully was able to take a joke when one emerged. And at least one of the consequences of that seemed to be that it never got truly toxic. And so I'm struggling with the morality of the 4chan approach, because there's a part of me that thinks, Jesus Christ, don't you have anything better to do? But there's also a part of me that thinks, well, wait a second, there's something really complicated going on here that has to do with the redistribution of power and also the acquisition of a voice by people who are individuals and not part of a corporate group, let's say, but who have access to tremendous technological power. And they're serving the function of jesters, and they're serving the function of comedians. And I think comedians in particular are the canaries in the coal mine for a free culture. As soon as the comedians are threatened, something's... As soon as the comedians are nervous, something's up. Because you should be allowed to make fun.
The biggest meme of yours that I use this meme of yours constantly on Twitter is the Kathy Newman meme. And one of those examples is, that famous interview you had, for people who don't know, where you were saying things that were pretty straightforward, or maybe people disagreed with you. And she would just ask you a question that seemed to be a complete non sequitur to what you had just said. And this kept going on for the whole time. The one that comes to mind is a picture of you saying, I had bacon and eggs for breakfast. And her reply is, so you're saying kill all vegans. So oftentimes if you have something on Twitter and someone responds with a non sequitur approach, you just reply with a picture of her, and people right away know, oh, so what you're saying is, and it has nothing to do with what it is you're actually saying. I think what you are saying, to be the opposite of Kathy Newman in this context, is accurate, in that a lot of powerful people are there through inertia, are there through nepotism, are there through corporate memes because they play the game. If I'm not part of the game, why should I be playing the game? And here's the other thing where I think these people are heroes, is the thing that they're best at is when it comes to the thing that is the worst, which is war. We are constantly proselytized in corporate media that war is great. We need to have people overseas. We need to have more troops, more whatever. If you have a president who is regarded as contemptible, if you look at Trump versus Barack Obama, it's a lot harder for that president who isn't venerated to send young men and women to die. Because if there's a skepticism about his pedestal that he's on, right away you really have to make sure you're selling this war, or otherwise there's going to be this, it's just easy to clown you because the arguments used for these wars are often so ridiculous on their face.
So what was the conclusion that you've drawn now? It's been a couple of years since you wrote The New Right. So, and what are your later thoughts on boards such as 4chan, and what's happening in 4chan now? It doesn't seem to... Go
I think 4chan has to some extent fallen away as a cultural force. I mean, they were trying to meme Trump into the presidency, and that happened successfully in 2016. The Donald, which was the board on Reddit, was banned during the election. I think they respawned as the Donald.win. And these other, and again, with these decentralized things, if you try to figure out where everyone's going, then you're going to have subgroups. People define themselves by opposition, not by unity. So anyone who has any kind of ideology will tell you the people they argue with the most are the ones who are basically 1 degree of separation away from them within that ideology. So I think right now there is kind of a what happens next now that there's a Biden presidency, but the focus has shifted. And I think this is extremely healthy for those of us who value liberty. It has shifted from Washington, and this has always been kind of the background, to corporate media, and understanding that Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell and Ted Cruz will never despise you and will never have as much contempt for you as the editorial board of the New York Times or the people at the New Yorker. They're much, or let alone many academics. So having the trolling and the memes be much more focused on what Mencius Moldbug calls the cathedral.
Why do you think that's true? And why do you think that's true? Because that's quite a radical statement, I would say. But I think it does speak to this T-shirt that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So your sense, what you just told me, was that there is this elite contempt. And to some degree, it was associated with the political class. But on further analysis, it's not the political class. Right. It's the chattering literati, the chattering educated literati. And I actually happen to think that that's the case, that's actually true. So why do you believe that?
Oh, sure. I'll give you a couple of examples. First, and the arch villains, and I'm not trying to troll you, are the university professors. That's where the poisoning really, really starts. But let me give you an example to demonstrate which is wagging the dog, whether it's because used to be the argument was about Washington. Andrew Breitbart, who certainly falls into this New Right kind of context, made the quote about politics being downstream of culture. And the idea was, wait a minute, if we're fighting in Washington, by that time it's already, 4th down and we're down how many points? It's the consequence of what led up to this. Let's suppose I was a Democratic congresswoman or congressman, and I thought President Trump was a Nazi, Klansman, horrible, Hitler, every name in the book. At the same time, I did not think that there was any kind of collusion with Russia or any kind of something wrong with that phone call. Maybe he's a jerk, but I certainly don't think he should be impeached or removed from office. All my constituents have been hearing for months from the televangelists of the left, Don Lemon, Rachel Maddow, Trump Russia, Trump Russia, Trump Russia. How could I, as a Democratic congressman, go back to my constituents and say, guys, I agree with you. This guy's the worst president in history, and he's a despicable human being, but you don't impeach someone over this. This is, ratcheting up and nonsensical. As a congressperson, I would not be in the position to make that claim. And I think that is a good demonstration of who is in charge of whom. There's a clip online I'm sure people can find where Don Lemon from CNN had John Kasich on, former, House Budget Committee Chairman, governor of Ohio. He was a major presidential contender in 2016. And he's yelling at him, John. And you're sitting there and it's very clear who regards themselves as the authority and who is regarded as the subject in that relationship.
So what if I said, maybe we should just stop caring about that too, because the technological playing field for communication has been leveled so drastically that the New York Times and the legacy media types are basically dead in the water, and that's just going to play out inevitably over the next 3 or 4 years. And let me give you just a quick example.
Can I just say one
Yes,
sentence?
please.
If they were dead in the water, the lockdowns couldn't have happened.
I don't think they're dead in the water now, but I think the writing's on the wall.
I agree. That's why I'm going to write a book called The White Pill, because I'm so optimistic. I think they're on borrowed time. Completely agree.
So then we can also talk about what happens next, and we can talk about the difference between podcasts and legacy media too, which I think I'm trying to think through right now, and because I think the YouTube podcast long form structure is revolutionary in all sorts of ways that we are just starting to understand. I was talking to Russell Brand a week ago, and he talked about voiceless people and how we're increasingly becoming voiceless. And I thought, well, wait a second, that's true in one sense, perhaps, but it's very untrue in another sense that might be more important, because now everyone's a TV station if they want to be, and everyone's a radio station if they want to be, and everyone's a publishing house if they want to be. It's right there at their fingertips. Sure. And there's no, apart from impediments that get thrown up now and then, like YouTube banning people and so on, it's if you want to have a voice, all you have to do is buy a $100 microphone and use your laptop and bang, you have whatever audience you can draw in.
Yeah.
And so, and that is playing itself out in our culture extraordinarily rapidly. And so maybe that's just like the 4chan discussion that's drawn from your book, The New Right. The culture's moved past that. That's already history. It might be the case that the continued dominance of the main narrative by the legacy media types, that's already done. We're just mopping up the ashes.
That's exactly my perspective, and this is why it's often so frustrating with me on social media, because I think it's inevitable. I don't see how if I'm the New York Times or if I ask myself this question fairly often. I said, if I'm CNN, what could I do to regain the trust of this young population? What steps would I take? And they're really in a bad, it's like Marlboro. One of my quotes is, I said, the battle is won when the average American regards a corporate journalist exactly as they regard a tobacco executive. You are never going to have the guy who runs Marlboro be someone that you trust and think is an unmitigated good person. You understand his job. You might say, look, these have to be legal. It's a horrible habit of, and so on and so forth. And I get how he's getting a paycheck, and I get how it could be used in moderation. But regardless, there's better ways to improve humanity than selling tobacco.
Well, I look at the BBC, for example, tried to formulate a channel for young people, and they did exactly what you'd expect. Appeal to progressive causes, and the truth of that didn't work at all. And why didn't it work? It's because for young people, broadcast TV is so dead that they don't even notice the corpse.
Yeah,
right. It's just not there. It's just not an issue, and no wonder, because the technological advantage of on-demand video, both production and consumption, is so that the advantage of that is so great that those old forms are just, they're terminally dead. And so when I go and have an interview with a TV person, it feels like I'm going back into the 70s, and I'm not doing them anymore. And I can get into that in a little while. But what happens is, the person that you're talking to isn't a person, and whatever it is that you're having isn't a conversation. We're having a conversation when we're doing this right. I'm sure we bring our flaws to this and our arbitrary preconceptions and our biases and all that. But my sense is that when a podcast goes well, I can tell because I'm interested in the conversation. And the reason I'm interested in the conversation isn't because I've got some viewpoints that I'm hammering forward that you have to attend to, but that I've got some ideas that I can throw at you, and then I can see what you do with the ideas and take them apart and add what you can to them, and then I can have different ideas, and we can do that collaboratively over the course of the dialogue, and we can include all the people that are watching this in the process. And it's like this long form allows for the truth being something like an investigation into the truth instead of the truth. And
right.
We don't want to underestimate how much of that is purely a consequence of the technological revolution. Because now there's time, right? We can make mistakes and it doesn't matter because the bandwidth is unlimited.
Yeah, if I'm a roulette player, and I mentioned this in the book as well, all my money is on technology being what saves us. I think politics literally only causes problems, and it's not a place for any kind of solution. You cannot look to Washington for solutions. What's funny is when you listen to corporate media, a lot of times they will acknowledge something's a problem, but then when that problem is solved exterior to it, they start to panic. We have heard, you and I are both old enough to remember, that there was a lot of hand-wringing correctly, that we live in a soundbite culture, that it's not reasonable that a politician who might have a new innovative way to solve for poverty, to solve for the environment, to solve for, out of wedlock births, they have some program, but they have to wrap it up in 10 seconds. It's very hard to make that point. And as a result, this rewards glib people or people who have good one-liners, but someone who's inarticulate, who has great ideas, that person is going to be dead in the water. And that's going to create results that we not necessarily like. So then people are like, you know what, this is true. Like you have people talking past each other, the Republican versus Democrat, broadly what they're going to say. It's fun when they get a zinger in, but I'm not going to have the needle moved. I'm rooting for my team, and it's kind of a sports phenomenon. Podcasts come along. We're going to have a long conversation where both of us are listening to each other. I might disagree with you. I don't have a political party behind me. Neither do I.
Well, hopefully you'll disagree with me. Hopefully that you'll do it. Not only will you disagree, but more importantly, that you'll do it in an interesting way that's interesting also to me. Because if you disagree with me, there is some possibility that you know something I don't. And if you disagree, I could learn something from you. Yeah, the
smartest person is ignorant of 99.99% of knowledge. This is the mistake that these kind of overeducated people think. They think just because I'm smart, I know everything. You're still going to be profoundly ignorant. You're just going to be knowledgeable about certain things very specifically. But getting back to the point I was saying earlier, now that we have these long conversations and people can really delve into ideas, and people listening to us might think we're both full of crap, but now they're at least challenging their own views and being like, why do I disagree with both of them? You don't have that space on CNN by nature of its organization. And now what CNN and other outlets had correctly posited as a problem has been resolved, but it's been resolved at their expense. So now the hue and cry is there's misinformation. People are being told dangerous ideas. Yeah, it's dangerous to your hegemony. It's dangerous to your prominence. CNN, Brian Stelter had a whole segment. I don't think he named Tim Pool by name, by saying, how is it that these YouTube shows, news shows, have orders of magnitude bigger than us? What do we do about this? It's like, this is literally every market. Like, I'm a publisher or I make apples. Someone comes along, their apples are, people like those apples better. You don't call in the state. You don't regard this as some kind of, abomination against the natural order of things. You're like, okay, crap. What nerve is Tim striking that I can learn from? But they're never interested in that because they're not interested in learning. They're interested in teaching, or more specifically, training their audiences what to think and believe. And you see this in social media. I made this joke over the weekend. In the same way that Christians regard the Trinity as one God in three person, you have these entire populations, which is one mind in many, many persons, because the people will watch John Oliver or they'll watch, some other show on the right. And the next day, not only will they be repeating these views, but they're repeating them verbatim. And that is when you realize, oh, there's no mind there. We're trained since we're kids correctly that it's important for us to be informed on current events. So what these shows do very perniciously is they will bring up an issue that the person hadn't heard about before, which is important for us to understand, sure, but immediately we'll train them on how to look at this issue and what their correct emotional response is. And people are hungry for that because they want to present themselves as informed, but they don't have the time or the capacity to undertake the critical or independent thought to do that. So it comes prepackaged for them. So it's kind of the TV dinner of the mind.
Well,
that's a good metaphor.
But the network format, all of it, the whole technological apparatus, including the corporate funding as a consequence of the expensive bandwidth, absolutely demands that.
Yes.
I never feel more like content than when I go to a TV station. And everyone in there is in some sense held hostage to the limitations and advantages of that particular technology. And as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message.
Yeah.
And a lot of what looks like even corporate think or corporate malfeasance is merely a consequence of that strange technological limitation. The networks have to assume that everybody watching has no memory and no education and no attention span because the bandwidth requirements demand that. And now that's all gone. So let me ask you about this. So now all of a sudden, the network, everyone's a TV station. Okay, so now one thing that the dominance, let's say, of the three major TV stations from, say, 1950 or thereabouts till 1995, maybe something like that, there was the imposition of something like a coherent national narrative. And now you can object to that, and you should, because in some sense it's imposed. But it's a collaborative imposition between these technologically powerful companies and the government. The journalists couldn't be too corrupt if they chased after the politicians, because then they wouldn't get access. And the politicians couldn't be too corrupt because the media would, disrobe them. But there was this sense of unity, and now you get this immense multiplicity. And so, you're more anarchically oriented, I would say, temperamentally than I am, but...
Oh, I am an anarchist, yes.
Right. But there is a danger in fragmentation. That's diversity is fragmentation, but enough fragmentation, you get nothing but endless conflict as people try to work out how they're going to cooperate. So...
I don't think that's necessarily true, because I think you're taking it as a given that cooperation is desirable, or that this unity of some kind is desirable. I think what's coming up in certain circles, which I was the first one to posit this in 2015, is in America, at least, the idea of a national divorce. Recognizing that we've had at least two cultures since the very beginning. They're being held together through, often nefarious means. And if one group regards Donald Trump as literally Hitler and an authoritarian strongman, which you can very easily make the case for that, and the other group regards, Joe Biden as basically someone sitting in his own urine behind the Resolute desk, there's no reason other than some kind of sense of inertia for these two or more groups to be under the same polity, or both. There's no reason for you to have the president you don't want. And increasingly, as conversation becomes and discourse collapses, because I think social media does tend to drive our ideologies to their logical conclusions, which leads to extremism, which could be both a good thing or a bad thing. It is going to be harder and harder, to the point where it's impossible to, have these sort of conversation. And we're seeing it also in Europe.
But there are reasons for the necessity of the unity. So you talk about Jonathan Haidt in your book, in the New Right, and there's a lot of psychological investigators, myself included, when I was doing research, who were looking into the temperamental basis of political affiliation.
Right.
And so roughly speaking, on the left end of things, you get the high open people who are creative in their thinking and
Yes.
and who are temperamentally in favor of the free flow of information, and tend to be lower in conscientiousness, particularly orderliness. And then you have the people who lie on the other side of that, who are higher in orderliness and lower in openness. And I tried to figure out why that was the fundamental political axis, because there's 5 temperaments.
Yes.
So why only those 2 as the major determinants of political affiliation? And what it boiled down to for me is that, and I think this isn't my discovery precisely, but I think it's the most significant discovery in political psychology in the last 50 years, is that it's probably that because borders are the fundamental political issue. And I don't just mean borders between countries. I mean borders between concepts. I mean borders between categories, countries, states, towns, people. The conservative types think you have to hold things together.
Yep.
Because if they dissolve, they die. And the liberal types think, well, wait a second, you bloody well need to maximize information flow. And the truth of the matter is, sometimes one of those perspectives is right for that situation and sometimes the other. And even look at the advantages of free trade and then the disadvantage of a worldwide epidemic. That's a great example. It's like, well, are open borders good? Well, they do facilitate the transmission of disease. And it turns out that the probability that infectious disease will be transmitted in a given political locale is actually a very good determinant of political belief within that locale. So wherever there's more infectious disease, people are much more conservative, and it's a huge effect. So something very fundamental is going on at the bottom of our political thinking. But having said all that, that also means that both of those types are necessary, because sometimes one has the right solution and sometimes the other. But even more importantly is that there's no way of getting rid of that dichotomy if you have groups of human beings. And so if we can't have a unity emerge that allows both those types of people to coexist, then what we're going to have as a consequence is conflict. And who knows how severe that can become. So we have a choice. It's like unity, however fragile that might be, or the degeneration into something like conflict. And that's not preferable to cooperation, all things considered.
Oh, I disagree. I think it is comparable, and I don't think the alternatives, I don't think that the unity means cooperation. I think unity means oppression.
Sometimes I don't disagree with that in some sense.
I'm saying all the time, unity through politics always means oppression, because the political system can only be used to silence people and force them to do what they otherwise would not want to do. Otherwise, they would do it on a voluntary basis. So any of these calls of unity, in my view, are always sleight of hand to marginalize or oppress a certain population. Now, sometimes that's necessary.
Like classic postmodernism, that postmodernist, that's the fundamental claim of the power theorists, the French power theorists. And there's some... that's not an insult, by the way.
Sure.
But look, if you take 10 kids and you have them play the same game, all the kids get to play the game, but not all of them get to play the game they wanted to at that moment. But at least they all get to play a game. And so there's cooperation there and there's utility in it. Now you can say, well, the tyranny of the game has been imposed, and that's true, but both of those things are true at the same time. And it doesn't seem reasonable to equate cooperation with tyranny. It's reasonable to point out that cooperation could degenerate into tyranny.
I think you just kind of dropped the mask a little bit, because you, in your example, posited these are children. So by its very nature, all these things that you're talking about in a positive sense have to force some group to be a second-class citizen, or at least obedient to some kind of elite. And this is something that I think is the benefits of this, at the very least, are enormously overblown. I think freedom means every kid can play the game that they want. There might
but
not be
with other people. That's the problem.
I disagree.
And I use children as an example because I was concentrating on games, and because it's out of games that the polity emerges over the course of its natural development. So it's not a rational top-down imposition, all things considered. It's the emergence of a game-like structure that incorporates more and more people. And see, if you take 2-year-olds play their own game. And each of them plays their own game. But by the time they hit 3 or 4, they have to be able to integrate the game they're playing with what other children want to play, so that they can play games with other children, which they're unbelievably motivated to do. And it means that each of them have to subordinate their instincts, so to speak, for the moment, but hypothetically they gain as a consequence of their mutual subordination to this higher order game.
I don't see it as subordinate. So if my choices are play this game by myself or play this game I like second with a lot of other people, I would value this. I'm playing a game in order to have fun. So in that case, the first game, which is my most favorite game, if no one wants to play with me, it's not going to be that fun. So it is rational and not at any sense of subordination to choose my second preferred game because now I'm having fun being able to play it.
Well, let's look. I would say that what we're doing here is a game, and I don't mean that in any negative sense. You're allowing, by participating in this conversation, you're allowing for the possibility and the belief, I would say, that whatever we're doing collaboratively is of more utility at the moment than whatever you could be doing individually at the moment.
Correct.
Because otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. Okay,
Correct.
So, and I would say that we are cooperating, we're also competing, and we also might be tyrannizing each other to some degree. But there's something in this mutual interaction that we're engaging in voluntarily that is cooperative and that isn't being enforced by some external agent.
Right. It's entirely cooperative. This is my whole point. This is why I'm an anarchist, because this is when people are doing things voluntarily, they are going to choose the things that are preferable to them. The problem, and when you have conflict, is when you have a third actor coming into our conversation and being the state and forcing both of us to do something we would not want to do for their sake. And that, when you play that out, that game on a national, international scale, that is the definition of oppression. Instead of you and I having a podcast, why aren't we in the factory making socks for poor people? That's of more utility, says the third party who's not involved here. And that's the danger, in my view, and the legitimacy of that kind of third party.
It is. So the developmental, I picked up a reasonable number of my ideas about the relationship between games and morality and higher order social structures from the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. And he was interested in the science of ethics, essentially. And his goal was the reunification of science and religion, actually, and although very few people know that about Piaget. And he pointed out quite clearly that a cooperative game would outcompete a tyrannical game over time, because the tyrannical game had to waste resources in enforcement, whereas a cooperative game didn't, because people were voluntarily going to go along with it. So then you say, well, I think you can make a perfectly credible case that if you could choose between two games and one of them involved force and the other didn't, and they had the same end, let's say, that the cooperative game is to be preferred, and it's also more sophisticated. But I would say as well, we actually don't know how to pull that off. Some of it's just lack of ability. Well, when you integrate so many people, like you have 330 million people in the United States, it's really hard to organize a cooperative game.
Well, that's the role of the corporate press. The corporate press puts forth the agenda of the power class and gets everyone persuaded to do that which they had wanted to do. Mario Cuomo, whose book I got paid, Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, whose book I got paid to read, he said explicitly in his book that if this wasn't done through voluntary compliance, I wouldn't be able to pull off half of this. And what is allowed to happen is you have decentralized enforcement of these rules. And we saw this during the lockdowns, where every low status person had an opportunity to assert dominance over somebody else by going up to them and yelling at them that they're not wearing a mask, even though going up to them ostensibly is going to put your life in danger. And you made a very cogent point about how persuasion is a lot cheaper than force. A lot of people use all these Orwellian 1984 comparisons, and I think the comparison to contemporary terms is much closer to Brave New World. And it's through the use of pleasure and the carrot, because it's a lot cheaper to persuade people it's in their best interest. Go along, you're going to give up your freedom, but I'm going to give you safety. And they'll be champing at the bit to do that. H.L. Mencken, the great cynic of the early 20th century, said that the average man does not want to be free. He simply wants to be safe. And for those of us who are fans of freedom, who regard liberty as a high value. The issue is, how do you engage in a polity with people who don't really find liberty of use and would rather have every minute of their life, whether through their corporate job or what they watch on TV or what they wear, pretty much decided for them. I mean, the speech in The Devil Wears Prada that Miranda Priestley makes about how you're wearing that blue sweater because the people in this room, chose the cerulean jacket 5 years ago, then it went to the fringe designers, then it became in the mall, then you found it on clearance, and you think it has nothing to do with you, but it was because we had made these decisions and it percolated down to you. And I think that top-down approach, I mean, Bernays talked about this, Walter Lippmann talked about this in the books Propaganda and Public Opinion. This was something that they figured out 100 years ago, specifically during the Woodrow Wilson administration. How do you get over the complete, fascist takeover of the United States, of course, under wartime premises, and get everyone involved in something that would have been completely alien to American thought just 5 years prior, that we're going to send all our kids over to Europe to fight a European war. This was a major revolutionary shift in how America regarded its relationship between the state and the population, and between America and the rest of the world. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to leave America as president. FDR just went to Panama, but that was like American territory at the time. Teddy Roosevelt. So they've been at this for 100 years. So they're playing the long game, and now it's starting to fall apart, thankfully.
Okay, so I got three things I want to ask you now.
Sure.
I want to know who they is. Okay, so then I want to know, in The Devil Wore Prada, were you on Miranda Priestley's side or on the side of the naive ingenue who was hypothetically tyrannized by her? And now I can't remember the third one. We'll stick with those two for the time being. So who's the they exactly?
Sure. So
because it's a shorthand, right? And it's a conspiratorial shorthand. So it's worth unpacking.
Sure. A conspiracy is just an organization that you don't approve of. The Constitutional Convention was a conspiracy. The Founding Fathers got together in Philadelphia to reorganize the Articles of Confederation. That was what had been their assigned task that they had sworn to. They get in there, lock the doors. They go, yeah, we're starting over, right, guys? They're like, yeah. And they swore themselves to secrecy. Now, we don't say conspiracy because we don't like that term, but this was very much a conspiracy.
Okay. Conspiracies usually involve deception and secretiveness, too. So
they swore themselves to secrecy.
Yes, fair enough, and there's a conspiratorial element there for sure. But there's lots of things that people do behind the scenes, so to speak, that aren't necessarily conspiratorial because they do them. They're not hiding them. So, but back to the they.
So basically, the model is you get the kids at a very young age. And you put them in government schools. They're taught many things that are nefarious, such as that your self-esteem should be a function of this mediocre person in the front of the room, that everyone should have the same work hours, that you're forced to be in a relationship with violent peers, that in no other situation are you forced to be locked into a relationship with them, with like bullies or just people who are, disruptive. But it starts with the universities. And this was by design. The American Economics Association, which was started, I think, in the late 1890s by Richard Ely, who was Woodrow Wilson's mentor. They always use Orwellian language. I'm contradicting myself, but the idea is we're training the next generation of elites. So basically, you have an entire population who go to these best universities, who are taught the same faith. And they had something at the time, which has degenerated now, called the social gospel. The quote, "What would Jesus do?" which contemporary Christians say all the time. This was posited by a socialist Christian, because the idea was, instead of an individual soul being able to be saved, which was kind of the central idea of Christianity and a big innovation in terms of historical individualism, the premise was a nation has a soul and a nation can be saved. Now, once a nation has a soul and can be saved, there is nothing outside your purview. Just like when we're talking about individual soul, the bedroom, the boardroom, how you are in public, these all tie into your salvation. And Eli and other in the UK, it was the Fabian Society, whose logo was literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. The premise it's kind of Gramsci's March to the Institutions. We're going to train the next generation of leaders. They're going to self-identify as leaders because they have the diplomas and degrees, and they're going to go out there and basically infect and take over the country, and it's going to be this top-down idea. And you see that it's percolated through this day. So it starts with universities, then you have all the journalists and people who work in media who are trained at these universities in the same ideas, and then the final consequence is the politicians. Now, for decades, what had happened was you had the Nancy's Pelosi of the world go on TV and say, truthfully and honestly, give me money, reelect me. I'm fighting Mitch McConnell and the wicked Republicans. And the Mitches McConnell went on TV and say, give me money, I'm fighting Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats. Meanwhile, while these two are engaging in this pantomime, the New York Times, Harvard are lobbing grenades over their shoulders, and they're not taking any fire at all. What has happened now is people are realizing people like Biden, McConnell, these are puppets of larger actors. And that's where the focus needs to be in terms of effecting change and liberating the West.
Okay. So let me act as defender of the patriarchy momentarily.
Sure.
Okay. And so I remember the third question, and this relates back to 4chan, is what and to anarchism for that matter, is that there's this critique of the social contract that's obviously in order and needs to continue, and the satirists and so forth are right to do what they do. But then there's the separate issue of what responsibility you owe your polity, and so and maybe none. You could make that case, but I want to address that. But in any case, let's look at the elite institutions in the United States and what's happened to them over the last 40 years, for better or for worse. So I know how this worked. So 100 years ago, Harvard, Yale, the Ivy Leagues, they were essentially aristocratic institutions, and you were in them as a consequence of birth. Okay, by the 1960s, that changed, and it changed to IQ-based meritocracy. Okay, the SAT is an IQ test. Now, people swear up and down it's not, but that's because they don't know anything about IQ tests.
Right.
So to make an IQ test, all you have to do is draw 20 random questions from a set of abstract questions, sum up the right answers, and rank order them across the population. That's basically all an IQ test is. It's that powerful. An SAT is an IQ test. Now, increasingly at the elite levels in the universities, IQ is the determining entrance requirement. And the average IQ of people in the Ivy League schools has gone up precipitously since the early 1960s, when it wasn't much higher than average. And now it's way higher than average. And now you can debate about whether or not that's a good thing. That's a separate issue, but that is what's happened. And the reason, there was a bunch of reasons for that. I mean, one was the realization that IQ is actually the best predictor of success in colleges. It's not that good, but it's 5 times as good as the next best predictor. And it's also relatively fair in that your SAT scores are, they're a better determinant of your success in university than which school you graduated from. So a very, very bright kid from a very bad school has a reasonable shot at Ivy League admission compared to, say, a very bad student at a very elite school. So there were socialists who were pushing the use of IQ as well as people who are more conservative. But in any case, there's no conspiracy at work there precisely. There's a decision on the part of the institutions as a whole that it would be better for the elite institutions to be based on merit as assessed by IQ, and that overall that would be better for the general population because hypothetically having smarter people make decisions, because they can make decisions using more information, is better for all concerned. And so there's a lot more going on at the upper ends of the elite institutions, let's say, than the mere conservation of multi-generational power. There's a positive element that I think is overlooked in a way that looks to me like the shirking of responsibility in revolutionary movements like those even that are spawned off of 4chan or that characterize anarchism. It's like, well, what responsibility do you have to what it is that's brought you to the point where, for example, you can have this technology-mediated conversation with me? Criticize away, but like, where's the emphasis on, where's the positive contribution and perhaps even the gratitude?
It's in the toilet where it belongs. I mean, I reject totally the idea that somehow we're on Zoom right now. I've got a mic from, I don't even know what brand. What I owe them is the cost that it paid me to buy their product. And what I owe you is to treat you with, which isn't much of a cost at all, with courtesy, dignity, and respect. Anytime people start talking about duties and responsibilities and gratitude, that's them invoking the unearned.
Well, wait. No. I don't think it's that cut and dried, even in your formulation, because you said, well, you pay for it, and fine. I'll leave that be and say that's a perfectly acceptable answer. But you did say that, that you believe that you have a moral obligation to what we're engaged in right now, right? You said you're going to treat me with, you said 3 words: dignity, respect, something else.
Courtesy, yeah.
Courtesy. So you do recognize that there's an ethos that should govern our interactions.
No, I think you've earned all those things. I don't act that way toward everyone.
That's fine. I have no problem with that. But I'm not trying to undermine your argument either. I'm really curious about this issue of responsibility, because I pushed it a lot, and I've tried to figure out what response. So look, from my perspective, I would say, well, your thought centers on the tyrannical element of the Great Father. And yes, fair enough. That's a major existential concern. So in terms of problems to focus on, it's a major problem. It's not the only problem, but it's a major problem.
Sure.
You could focus on the evil in your own soul. You could focus on the catastrophes of the natural world. Well, those are valid, large-scale domains of concern as well.
Sure.
But for me, it's okay, well, there is the tyrannical aspect, but there's the aspect of culture that you have enough food to eat, and that you have heat, and that you're the beneficiary of the structure that you're criticizing. And you could say, well, my criticism is making the structure stronger, but there's this element in your book and in the 4chan culture and so forth that seems to have this it's this random destructiveness that looks to me, it's not driven by something that's going to be clearly spoken of, and it's not driven by something that's aiming at a good end.
I think it's aiming toward a more honest end, because very often we're told things like, this person's a hero, that person's a hero, they should be valorized. And even if that conclusion is accurate, who are you to tell me that I need to valorize that person? I mean, one thing, it's like showing versus telling, like good writing, right? If you tell me this person has this accomplishment, that accomplishment, the natural, rational response is, this is a quality person, and we need more. I would love it if there was a world that had more people like this. But if there's so many outlets, more than you can count. Greta Thunberg's a great example. You have some random high school dropout who won't go back to school until literally everyone on earth changes the weather for her, and Time Magazine's calling her Person of the Year. I think to have that undermining of Time Magazine, and I got to tell you, there's lots of things you could say positive about her. That's very easy. She's made something of herself, but it's Time Magazine that's far more of the target than her. It's these agencies that presume to tell me who I should respect and value. And it's not on my terms. It's on their self-serving terms. You don't need to tell me that Black Lives Matter. I know this. I'm from Brooklyn. And you don't need to tell me literally every 5 seconds. And only we decide all together that they matter this month. And then next week, it's going to be gay history. So trans lives are going to matter. Then we go back to Black Lives Mattering. It's
so what? Fine. Look, fair enough. That's a compelling sequence of statements. It's what is it exactly? I'm not being smart. I mean that.
I that's something I would say when I am being smart. So that's why.
Okay. No, well, but I'm.
That's a compelling series of statements. That is such
I'm observing it. I'm observing it. Because you put the argument. You put the argument forward with force.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me to listen. Okay, so I know there's something to it. So I'm trying to figure out exactly what it is. So then I think to myself, well, what exactly is it that you're objecting to? Is it, now you said, well, it's moral flavor of the month. It's something like that. And it's the imposition of the moral flavor of the month that's objectionable. And that's somehow tied to the contempt, this elitist contempt. And I think that's fair. But it's the question to say, you say they, and the they contains the enemy in some sense. And so my question is, well, exactly what is the enemy, and who is the enemy, and where is it exactly? And
Harvard Yard The New York Times offices and Congress and the White House.
And corporations?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, where isn't it?
It isn't right here, you and I.
Okay,
it isn't
why?
when
Why?
Because
why right here and now? Why isn't it here right here and now?
I'll tell you why. Because neither of us are doing anything other than presenting our own perspective. We are letting people agree with us or disagree with us from their own choice. It's not going to matter to me or to you whether someone agrees or disagrees. You're speaking your truth. I'm speaking mine, to use a cliched expression. And at the very least, I hope that people are watching this and being entertained and having their thoughts provoked. I am not in any way regarding, and I certainly don't have the power to impose the idea that if you think I'm a jerk and full of crap, that somehow that makes you a bad person or that you should have some kind of social consequence as a result. These different organizations absolutely do. And let me give you one example. And this kind of speaks to cancel culture, which is obviously a very hot topic at the moment. The head of CrossFit, which is this big gay fitness organization, he came out during when we were all caring about specifically Black Lives Matter. And he said, look, we're about deadlifts and burpees. I don't know. We don't regard race as anything. We're about fitness and we're very diverse. What does that have to do with us? And he got fired as a result of this. So again, it's fighting against this. That's the big difference. Neither of us are in a position to, nor would we, I can't speak for you, but I bet you would agree with me, ever dream of telling someone, this is my example, North Korea, right? I did my book on North Korea, dear reader. It's an issue that means a lot to me. There's a lot of Americans who just simply don't care. I don't think they're bad people because I think there's very little they can do about it. There's very little I can do. All I tried to do with my book was move the needle and have people perceive the nation and its population differently, but I haven't liberated North Korea. So it's perfectly legitimate if they have different concerns or if they're not interested. But this is not how the cathedral works.
Okay. So I've been spending the last, when I give a lecture, yeah. I know what I'm doing enough to keep the audience interested, but I also know what I'm doing. Like I can say what I'm doing. I have the practice, but also a theory, and they match. And so before I give a lecture, I figure out what problem I'm addressing. I have to have that question in my mind. And then I have okay, I'm going to investigate this problem and I'm going to push my thinking more than I've already pushed it on my feet. And I'm going to use these 8 tools or places or stories as investigative tools. And then I'm going to see what comes out of that. And so that's, okay. And if I sit down and I really think about it, think it through, then the lecture will go well. And what I am doing, as far as I can tell, is thinking on my feet.
Sure.
And people seem to like watching that. Okay, now I've been thinking, all right, what are we doing in a standard TV interview? And what are we doing in a podcast? Because now I have this podcast and I'm enjoying it. And it's such a thrill for me because I can reach out to virtually anyone in the world and say, look, I'd really like to find out what you think. And they'll say yes, and I can talk to them. And so it's an unbelievably great thing to do. And then I've been thinking, well, I can feel when it's going well and when it isn't, when it goes flat. And when it's going well, we're doing what we're doing. It's kind of engaging and there's a pugilistic element to it. But there's no rancor. There's no outright anger. Or it's not directed at the process. We're engaged in this mutual exploration. That's what it looks like to me. And I've been trying to formalize that. So, when I have a guest, I have a series of problems that I'd like to investigate with them, and then I invite them to participate. And so then I think, well, to me, that's the logos in operation. And that's why people like it. The logos is this, it's exploratory verbal activity, something like that. And people really like that. And I talked to a Wall Street Journal journalist the other week about podcasts, and he said that the reason he likes them is because he doesn't know where they're going to go.
Yes, right? Exactly.
So they're agendaless in that sense, right? Because
and sincere in that sense, because you have to have some element of honesty if it's improv.
Yes, exactly. Well, and I also think these new forms really punish people who don't engage in that. So now and then I'll talk to a podcast host who's a legacy journalist, and they'll slip into, well, here's a question. It's like, is that your question or is that a question? Right. And it's sort of like a lecturer who reads the PowerPoint slides instead of talking spontaneously about the topic.
I completely agree, and I think this also speaks to why this kind of mechanism for conversation is so popular. People very rarely, and even you and I mean, have the opportunity to see two intelligent, informed people who might disagree about things have that long conversation with virtually no possibility of it being hostile. If it's not at a party, so you can hear each other, you can listen to it at your own leisure, and you're going to be learning something, or you're at the very least going to have, it's just fascinating conversational dynamics. Even if you and I were arguing over cake versus pie and which is better, and obviously the answer is cake because pies are messy, but at the same time it's fun because they're watching minds at work. It's just like when you're watching a gymnast, for example, or a great dancer. It's just exciting to see an aspect of the human mind, the human anatomy at its finest, or maybe we're getting a B, I don't know, but the point is to watch that
action.
Yeah, but when you see corporate anything, it's always unnatural. Is there anything more ironic than the expression reality TV? By its own nature, they admit this is not real. It's a lot of it's improv. It's all staged. It's all edited. Whereas what we're doing, we're not editing, and we're going to say and and we're going to have l'esprit d'escalier. We're going to cut off the mics, and I'm like, oh gosh, I wish I would have said that, and you're going to say something else. But that, I think, is what earnestness in a positive sense people are missing out, and that's the opposite of corporate America. Corporate America is synthetic, phony earnestness. I had this quote. I say, if you look at Times Square during Gay Pride, only corporate America can make sodomy and perversion seem downright boring. I mean, if you looked at the corporate presentation of people who are gay, you think what that means is hugging each other after brunch and shaking hands. It's this complete divorce from any kind of reality of any kind of culture.
I would say that the attribution of this, the identification of this with corporate America, with the universities, with the legacy media, all of that, it's like the Marxists criticizing capitalism for inequality of distribution. It's like inequality of distribution is a way deeper problem than any critique of capitalism will ever formulate properly or solve. And I would say, like, we're getting at something here that transcends the anarchist critique of structure. No, at least as it, like, or you could say, or you could say forces it deeper. Look, the ancient Egyptians had two gods, Osiris and Horus. And Osiris...
They didn't have two, they had a ton of them.
Yes, they had two main gods that made up their conception of sovereignty. Sorry, yes. The pharaoh modeled himself on the interaction of these two gods. There was Osiris, who was the state, for all intents and purposes, structure per se. And his sin was willful blindness and stultification. And Horus was the attentive eye, and in other formulations, the ability to speak. And so there's a dynamic there that was recognized a very long time ago that centers on this issue that you brought up about sincerity and truth. You know, you're complaining, and rightly so, when you hear stale repackaged ideas that are being presented for reasons other than the actual reason. It's something like that, isn't it? It's like, I can't trust what you're saying because you're actually using that language to manipulate me to do something that you're not stating.
Correct.
And that would be Mountain Dew and the naming. It's like, isn't this fun? It's like, well, maybe it's fun, but really you want to sell, Mountain Dew. And if you came out and said that, we wouldn't make fun of you. But if you're going to pretend, we're going to go after you.
And when it gets very pernicious, it's you're claiming you're fighting racism, but what you're really wanting is to promote war and killing of many, many people. So that is when the critique is more than Mountain Dew is what it is. It's selling. Mountain Dew is fun. I enjoy Mountain Dew. I don't drink it much because I'm in my late 80s, but basically kids like it. The different colors, different flavors. It certainly serves a purpose. You want to get buzzed out of your mind on the caffeine. More power to you. There's nothing other than some cavities. There's nothing really nefarious. There is something very nefarious when Amy Rohrbach is caught on a hot mic saying that they had everything on Prince Philip or Prince Albert, I always get them confused, who was friends with Jeffrey Epstein, that they had everything on the Clintons. And they got a call from Buckingham Palace. And because there was a Meghan Markle interview, on the table, that they killed this entire story. This is her talking on a hot mic. Meanwhile, if that camera turned off and you said, is it true that you had this international pedophile ring and one of the people in Buckingham Palace was involved and that, their lawyers called and you killed the story? She would say, are you crazy? That's a conspiracy theory. Harvey Weinstein is another example of this. There was a conspiracy. We all knew. Bill Cosby was another one. He got outed by Hannibal Buress, who was a comedian, who just said, look it up. All this stuff was bubbling under all these women. They weren't all completely silent. So I think that's the big difference between Mountain Dew and the corporate press. We're not talking about people who are promoting cavities. We're talking about people who are promoting war and depravity.
Okay,
or covering up for at least.
So if I said, well, maybe when I was reading your book and thinking about it a lot and thinking about 4chan and all of the things we've talked about, I thought, well,
have you been on 4chan since? Have you actually looked at it?
No,
Okay.
I'm ignorant about how 4chan works. So
it's just a message board.
Right. Well, I guess I knew that much, but I would also say I'm not familiar enough with message boards to really, to have a built-in sense of what that means. That's not an area of social communication that I've engaged in. And I'm not saying that with pride. It's a form of ignorance. I've learned not to despise social media platforms. You're a fool if you allow your willingness to despise them because you don't know anything about them to stop you from learning how to use them or from taking them seriously. They're serious, those things. So
yes.
They're revolutionary, those technologies. Okay, so I read and I think, well, wait a second. You seem to be not segregating the critique of corruption from the critique of structure. And this is also what I think is happening with the postmodernists. They look at hierarchies and they think, well, they're all based on power and here's the evidence of corruption. It's like, yeah, no kidding. But that doesn't mean they're only based on power. And it's the same with corporations. Like I know lots of people who work in corporate environments and some of them are really admirable. And the things they do in the corporate environments are also admirable. And I would also say that my experience has taught me that when corporations start to act the way you conceptualize them, their doom is sealed far more rapidly than people generally realize.
I agree.
They collapse. So you're not objective. So it's useful to disaggregate the critique of structure from the critique of deceit.
I think the deceit's baked in. I don't like using the word corruption because that implies these people can be saved and these organizations can be saved. I do not believe that they are, and even if they are, I'm not interested in saving them. I'm more interested in burning them down.
See, I don't see them as this is the they problem. You see, look, part of the reason I think
do you want to talk about Walter Duranty? I mean, you want to talk about Walter Duranty? These are the same exact actors that have had so much blood on their hands for decades and have never had any accountability. Let me give you one example.
But I always think that that's me, not them.
I don't. Why is that you? You don't work for the. Let me give you one example, and you can answer if you say if this sounds like you. We're all taught in school about William Randolph Hearst, the Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine, yellow journalism, right? And how the media would gin up these problems, which had literally thousands of deaths needless deaths as a consequence. Then there's a record scratch, and all of a sudden, all these outlets have no agenda and are objective and are decent actors. My point is there was never a record scratch. This has always been a problem for a very long time. And especially, this is something I would think would be very much up your alley, the amount that these organizations and the equivalents of contemporary actors have their role in putting over and maintaining the Soviet Union, and specifically Stalinism, which they have never apologized for, which they've had no accountability for. And now they're presuming to sit here and lecture the layman about being a decent person and being responsible. That to me is a complete abomination.
I agree with all of that except the attribution of blame. So let me ask you, I'm going to go sideways just for a second, but it's in service of this particular discussion. You said a little while ago that you were that one of the rules of engagement for us, as far as you're concerned right now, is that you are going to treat me with dignity, respect, and there was something else.
Courtesy.
Courtesy. Okay. And then I said, well, those are the cooperative rules. And you said to me, no, you earned it. And so I want to ask you, and then we'll go back to this other discussion if that's okay. What makes you think I've earned it?
Because I know a lot of people whose lives you have personally made better, because you're my friend's dad. So that automatically, there's no situation where I'm going to be mean to my friend or disrespectful to my friend's dad, certainly not in public. I think you are in many ways self-made. The fact that you are a successful author and you're encouraging a lot of people to, get their crap together, and you're not telling them. One of the things I tell, and this is something you and I have in common, is the goal isn't to be a perfect person, but you could certainly be a better person tomorrow than you are yesterday. And if you have that in your mind and you could say that objectively with a straight face, that goes a long way towards fighting feelings of anxiety or depression or hopelessness. Because when that voice in your brain, which we all have, is telling you're never going to find another job, you're never going to find another girlfriend. Look at you, you're sitting around playing video games. You go, wait a minute. I went to the gym today, and I've got the numbers here that shows I lifted more than last week. I'm objectively improved in one capacity. That is enormous. People don't appreciate.
You're absolutely right about that. I was stopped by 3 separate people this week who said they thanked me, and so whenever that happens,
no one likes a show off, Jordan.
when that happens, I always ask people what their name is to begin with, because they're usually.
They want to be seen.
Well, they don't know if they should interact with me. They don't know if they're being rude. They don't want to look stupid. It's complicated. But if I ask them their name and then engage, then they calm down right away and then they'll talk to me. But what I want to find out always, if someone says, well, you were helpful, I want to find out, okay, well, exactly why,
yes.
Right?
What did I say?
What did I do that helped you? Because then I can do it better, hypothetically. So 3 people told me the same thing this week, which is exactly the point that you just made, which is quite cool, was that they restructured their internal reward system. They stopped comparing themselves with other people. Well, stopped. Started to stop. And they started to learn how to reward themselves for making incremental improvements. So that was really cool. And I do think that you picked up something there that's absolutely crucial. So, but then I could also say to you, well, look, I'm also the face of the professoriate. Because
I know.
Right. So what does that signify to you? Does it signify that I'm an outlier, or that?
No, it just means you'll be the last one up against the wall. No, it's in all seriousness, one of the points I have made recently is that as awful as corporate journalists are, and as humorless and self-righteous and pompous, they are still better by all these metrics than university professors. And I'm not speaking about you personally, but you can, if you look at the thing that Twitter did so amazingly, is that back in the, and I'm thinking of someone specifically who I'll mention him in a second. Back in the day, you would think, I'm a Harvard law professor. That if I don't even know who this person is, that's going to tell me certain information. This is one of the highest quality minds in America. This person knows his industry inside and out. If he tells me something, I can take it to the bank. And that's actually true, because the Harvard law faculty is making the law in America far more than Congress, because it's their interpretation and those people they're trained. Then you look at Lawrence Tribe on Twitter, and you look that he is tweeting exactly verbatim the same kind of miserable anti-Trump things that your spinster aunt is tweeting, and you realize, wait a minute, this emperor has no clothes. This person might be very bright, which there's no question he's brilliant. There's no question he knows the law inside and out. But in terms that this person should be an object of venerance, and this is like one of the great minds of all time, it's a ridiculous absurdity when you see them given an opportunity to express themselves in public.
Okay, so I would say the emperor has some clothes, because I worked at Harvard for quite a long time, and many of the people I met there were genuinely estimable. And I've worked in lots of Okay.
No question.
It's the differentiation here that's of such critical importance, and
Pinker's The Blank Slate is a book everyone should read. I say that without any asterisks. It's an amazing accomplishment.
And you don't go beyond that and say, well, look at the structure that gave rise to that. And I guess it's
but Pinker is not that book is not a function of Harvard. That book is a function of him and his ideas and his work. And there's it's also a function of Harvard. One of the things that I really noticed about Harvard, the psych department in particular, when I was there, was that it was like, this is odd, but one of the things I've noticed among many academics is contempt for books. Interestingly, is that right?
Yes, it's far more common than you would ever think. But that wasn't true at Harvard. If you were a professor there in psychology and you wrote books, that was valued, genuinely valued. The people that I associated with there, and that was the bulk of the department, like they were, by and large, as genuine an article as I had come across. And so the institution actually did. Now look, I'm not happy with what's happened to the universities at all. I'm not. I think it's appalling. It's appalling. But when I was there in the 90s, the institution was set up so that people like Pinker could exist and be rewarded. And even more importantly, the institution was set up at that point to actually benefit the undergraduates. So the hierarchy of concern was the undergraduates. Now, you could be cynical and say, well, Harvard treated its 18-year-olds like potentially generous baby 40-year-old millionaires.
I don't think it was just that.
It wasn't just that. It wasn't. And after them was the senior professors, the full tenured. So it was an institution that had its ducks in order as far as I was concerned. And it was really quite a privilege to work there as a consequence, and a tremendous amount of academic and intellectual freedom within that structure. And that was built into the whole structure. So it was a genuinely respectable and remarkable institution. And it did a great job of finding students who were of incredibly high caliber. You know, like in the typical undergraduate Harvard class, a third of the class would be made of individuals who were as smart as anybody you'd ever meet. You know, yeah, so
this whole conservative idea that people who they don't like are also dumb is really one of the stupidest concepts in contemporary discourse. It's a lot easier to train a smart dog than it is to train a dumb one. And many of the people who are putting over some of these extremely malevolent, nefarious ideas, they're very, very bright. There's no question about it. But my respect for
they
Pinker,
weren't just bright. They were also ethically admirable in a deep sense. And you see that with Pinker, say, and you see that with Jonathan Haidt, who's a centrist, a moderate centrist, but you know, he's a tough character. He stands up for what he believes in. He makes coherent and cogent arguments, and he's no pushover. And
I praise Haidt very heavily.
I know you do. I know. Well, that's partly why I'm taking this apart, because I mean, there's this element of the anarchy philosophy that is, I suppose, evident in 4chan as well. But in your writing, that it seems to me to have the danger of producing a premature cynicism.
I wouldn't call it cynicism.
Okay, well,
I mean, I'm a big fan of Camus. And Camus, Albert Camus, the French novelist and philosopher, he regarded cynicism as the enemy. I completely agree. I think it's important to, just because an enemy exists, just because malevolent actors exist, even if you don't want to say it's the Harvard graduating class, which I'm not saying, that in no way means that human beings are inherently evil or inherently corrupt. It just means that there's a population and you have to, just like an infection, work your way around. So I think cynicism is a very, very, very it's the cost of cynicism on an individual level cannot be overstated.
It's corrosive. It's unbelievably
the worst. Yes, and one of the things I fought for in this book, and I fight for it in when I do podcasts and social media, is there are so many people who think it's hopeless, and then they give up, and then they're just kind of it becomes their mindset. Whereas the point is, if there's any chance that you're going to come out ahead, you better stand on your feet and go out swinging. And even if you lose, you're going to go down at least knowing I did everything in my power, and you're going to have happiness, pride, and self-esteem as a consequence. So I reject all forms of cynicism. And if that is what I am implying, then I'm doing something wrong.
Well, look, I'm not saying that my reading of what you wrote or what you're doing is canonical. I mean, you're not the only anarchist in the world, after all, and so I'm not going to dump all of this on you. But you know, the reason that I have been concentrating on people's individual development, I think, well, apart from the fact that I'm a psychologist, and I think there's also less danger in that in some sense, because the revolution just occurs within, you know, and
Sure.
innocent people who don't want your goddamn revolution aren't forced into it.
Right.
I guess by concentrating, see, you said that you implied that I'm not the corporation and that you're not the corporation. But you see, I actually don't believe that's true. I believe that I am, in fact, the corporation, and that I'm even the evil corporation. And I'm so tangled up in that world, like we all are, that we bear responsibility for that fact. And so I think, well, what do you do about that? And it seems to me that you try to get your act together on a personal level to identify the enemy within, which is the right place to start, and then work outward from that. But your critique is basically a social critique, as far as I can tell, that you're starting with the institutions themselves, even though it's not the institutions exactly, it's the corruption of the institutions.
But corruption, it makes it seem like this is something that can be salvaged, whereas in my view, these institutions are inherently malevolent.
I know that's your view, but they're no more inherently malevolent than individuals are.
There are plenty of individuals who are inherently malevolent. They go into politics.
Well, not everyone who goes into politics is inherently malevolent. You know, I've met with many, many politicians, and I'll give you an example. Because
that just means they're good at passing.
No, it doesn't just mean that. I had a dinner in Washington with a group of Democrats and Republicans. It was part of an attempt to, you know, they never talk to each other. They don't have time. Like, I would not want the job of an American No, they don't.
Okay.
Their time is so...
Stop. No. They're not running an ambulance. They're not an ER doctor. It's just not a priority for them. They have time. Give me a break.
Well,
they just have to take stuff. Don't call back your lobbyist and they have to, are you kidding me? You're telling what people, if there's one thing people in Washington have, it's time. Things go at a glacial pace.
Look, you're making an attribution of corruption to complex structures, and so I'll accept that. But then I don't
use the word corruption, but go ahead.
Well, pick a word that's more suitable, because I'd be happy to use it if it's more suitable. Malevolence.
Depravity? Malevolence, sure, malevolence, yeah.
Fine. Power and malevolence. Okay, well, when you're a congressman and you're tossed into the Congress, the structure produces such an intense surround for you that it's extremely difficult not to just go along with it, especially when you're new and you don't know what the hell you're doing. So you end up spending a tremendous amount of your time, for example, a disproportionate amount of your time, even though you hate it, in an office that isn't yours, in some warehouse, phoning people for money. And that's like half your time. And you think, well, you don't have to do that. It's like, well, you kind of have to, because all the other...
You absolutely have to.
Right. Okay, so in any case, they don't end up talking across the aisle and their time is very tightly scheduled. And we brought them together to have them talk. And I wanted to do a bunch of that, but my health collapsed and couldn't do any more of it. But in any case, each of them went around the room and said why they went into politics. These were mostly younger congresspeople. And if you would have been there, there's two things that would have impressed you and surprised you, I think. One would be how common the stories for motivation were across the participants, regardless of their party affiliation. And the second would be how believably and genuinely sincere they were in that narrative. You wouldn't have walked away with the assumption that those people were any more corrupt than people you admire and respect.
That's what makes them good at being corrupt, because they can pass.
Well, but I would say the same about all of us.
I'm not voting to have people sent overseas to slaughter innocent human beings.
Well,
so
you
I
are
agree
if you
with
vote.
I don't believe in voting.
Well, then you are if you don't vote.
I agree with you completely that we should be skeptical of people and their motivations. I do not agree that if someone is nice to their family, I have no doubt that all these politicians adore their family, that they have genuine concerns, that I'm sure they said they want to make the world a better place. If you are comfortable using force to send armed men to harm innocent people, I don't care if you're nice or have good motivations. You are a bad human being.
So I just finished a podcast with Jocko Willink.
Okay.
It released today. And he did all that, like really. And it isn't obvious to me that he's a bad person. In fact...
Jocko was in politics? How was he?
No, but he was a soldier. And he was a commander. Okay. Well, I mean, he made decisions that, he was a politician in some sense because he had to make strategic decisions about how policies were going to play out on the actual battlefield. So because he was a commander, there's a political element to his job because it's nested inside the democracy and he is making decisions. And so, I find it very, and it is perplexing to some degree. It's very difficult to walk away from a conversation with Jocko and not think anything other than that's a really admirable person. And it does tangle us up in this problem that you just described, which is, well, what about force? And what about the army? And what about the police for that matter? But it isn't them, it's us. Again, it's the same
problem. Not a cop. Mm-hmm. I'm not a cop. It is them. I'm not a cop. I would never put my hands on a peaceful person and try to force them to come with me in my car. I would never club an old man in the head simply because he's in a park. I would never force people to be defenseless in their own home by enforcing unlawful gun right laws.
But would you stand up for someone who is being beat in public?
It depends on the context.
Fair enough. Look, are there circumstances under which you could imagine doing that?
Oh, I was just going to say, listen, if it's one guy versus 50 cops, me jumping in is not going to help him, right? But there's absolutely circumstances I would do that. Not even a question. I've done it too.
Circumstances that you would use force.
I don't know. Well, I don't, because I'm a small guy. I'm not trying to be glib, but in all seriousness, I'm short and I'm small. So here's something that has happened. This is not particularly courageous on my part. If you have two guys who are getting into it and they're getting each other's face, and they're that posturing thing where they're about to fight, I have been in between and been like, come on, step away. So in that case, yes. But in terms of having to use a gun or club someone to death, thankfully, I've never been in a position where I've had to make that decision. And I do not begrudge people having to make that decision either. It's not an easy choice. There's no good answers in that situation. But if you take tax money and as a result of your job, you're going to be harming innocent people in traumatic ways, I do not agree you should sleep easy at night.
So, people have criticized me, I suppose, for concentrating on individual development, moral development, say, well, there's all these global social problems that are best addressed at a sociological level. And, who the hell cares if you clean up your room when there's systemic racism? And I think, well, if you're going to address systemic racism, then you better have a clear head while you do it. And if you can't get the simplest parts of your life, let's say, in order, well, maybe that's what you should be concentrating on. It's not like I don't think that people should go off and solve even more complex problems. I mean, there seems to be an element of externalization in the criticism of power structures that I find psychologically counterproductive. Because when I studied the horrors of the 20th century, the Holocaust and the Stalinist horrors, and I always imagined myself as the perpetrator instead of the victim. Because the question for me was how it was that we could do this to each other, that we are doing it to each other. And I mean we. And I do also think the reason I've got away with my finger-shaking moralizing, let's say, to the degree that I have got away with it, is because I do include myself in the target of moral reprobates who could use some improvement. And I see the emphasis, I don't see that there's much of a distinction between the emphasis that you place on a broad-scale social critique, assuming corrupt power is the what fundamental organizing principle that large organizations adopt to organize, and the same thing that leads to identity politics on the left.
I don't think every organization is inherently built in corruption. I don't think Tropicana is built in corruption.
So how do you make the distinction?
Tropicana doesn't use force and doesn't try to. Tropicana says, look, our orange juice is the best, freshly squeezed. They get it to your store at a cheap price. I'm assuming it's cheap. I haven't bought it in a long time. You're free to choose it or not as you want. Tropicana doesn't try to make you out to be a bad person if you prefer apple juice or soda or water, right? These other organizations are playing mind games with people.
Okay, so it's the deceit. It's at least in part, it's the use of deceit that you're objecting to.
And let me speak to something you said earlier. It's different for you. I was born in Lvov in Western Ukraine. We came here when I was 1.5, but I was raised in a household where we spoke Russian. I'm Jewish. That was one of the reasons I fought so hard when I wrote my North Korean book, and why I've been talking about North Korea as an issue, because my family was the victim. Being Jewish under Stalin, during that period, these are really two big bullets that we dodged. And one of the reasons I went there to write about it and why I talk about it so constantly is because there, but for the grace of God, I could be in North Korean concentration camp right now. So I think there is, I don't know if there's a duty, but certainly if I'm in a position to, advocate for people who are not in a position to really speak for themselves, and these are the people who no one disagrees has it the worst. No one disagrees that whether you're conservative, Trudeau, Trump, Biden, whatever, that we need more liberalism in North Korea. We need more human rights. We need these people treated with a certain modicum of decency. It's just unconscionable. I'm going to do something about it in my very, very little way. So I think it's different given your and my background, how you're approaching these horrors of the past, because that was my grandma and my grandparents.
Well, is there a difference? I guess it isn't clear to me exactly what the difference is. I mean, you're objecting to the use of deceit and power. And violence, though. I would not have been in a position to have been that Nazi, quite literally. I wouldn't have been in a position to be that GPU agent. And one of the reasons I am an anarchist is I do not feel comfortable forcing another person to live as I see fit. I just think, who am I? Yes, well, I think that's an admirable moral principle. It isn't obvious to me that the logical conclusion of that is anarchism, I suppose. That would be my objection. Okay. I mean, and I do believe that degenerate power structures exist and they use deceit, and that's reprehensible and should be fought in every possible way. I mean, my sense has been that there isn't anything more powerful to fight that than spoken truth. I agree. And humor. Well, because if they're using, it's very rare. Go ahead, talk about humor. If they're using manipulative tactics in order to further their goal, as opposed to rational discourse, as you and I having, we're putting our cards on the table. If you're using things like deceptive editing and characterizing things out of context, you're not owed a rational, fair response. You're not acting as a decent, fair actor. So humor is very useful in this mechanism because it explodes not only the particular thing you're saying, but your role as someone who's worthy of courtesy, respect, and decorum. When I was interviewed by Kathy Newman, there was a point where I asked her, I guess, why she felt she had the moral right to offend me she was questioning me, and it stopped her. The question stopped her. And that was when the person emerged from the corporate shell, let's say, or the corporate shell / ambitious persona, because that's what I was talking to. What wasn't a person. And she emerged and she was set back, and I had a second or two to think then about how I would respond to the fact that her mask dropped momentarily. And I said, gotcha. And it was a calculated risk. It was supposed to be funny, and I do believe that people responded to it as if it was funny. And I thought, well, is this a time? Is this a place where I can drop a joke? Is this a place where I can say something? And I wasn't thinking about it strategically precisely. I was thinking about it more in terms of its ethical appropriateness. And I do believe that humor is an immense what would you say, an immensely important element of the search for truth, just as play is, and humor is there's something about it that's an act of self-transcendence too, if you can laugh at yourself, right? Because you're simultaneously the thing that needs to be laughed at, which is already behind you if you're laughing at it. You're moving ahead to the better you in the mere fact of allowing yourself to satirize yourself. And
so what you're saying is you're going to be a stand-up comedian.
Well, I think I have more affinity with stand-up comedians in some sense than with any other sort of person.
That's true. Yeah, because you are getting on a stage, you're putting on a performance. There's going to be moments of unexpected twists and turns in what you're saying, and as a function of that, it's going to cause hopefully things to put together in their brain. So yeah,
it's also better when I can be funny, and when I'm not very healthy, it's hard to be funny. But it's a loss. Like the best lectures that I ever gave have humor in them, and I mean, hooray for that. And, that's partly why I toured with Dave Rubin, too, was to add some levity to what... I mean, I learned early on that even if you're discussing things of incredible seriousness, like genocidal seriousness, that if
let me give you an example, because that's the whole premise of my book. Dear Reader, the North Korea book, it's farcical because it's Kim Jong-il's autobiography. I went there, I read all their literature, and I took the things that these people are taught, and since it's in his voice, they're presented at face value. And let me give you one example of this. Kim Jong-il is having, and how the truth comes in between the lines of, an anecdote. So Kim Jong-il is at this meeting, the dear leader of North Korea, and someone's giving a talk, and he's working on papers, and every so often his assistant is asking him for input. And the speaker stops, and Kim Jong-il goes, "Why are you stopping?" He goes, "Well, dear leader, you're working on those papers. You've got your assistant." He goes, No. I could do all these three things at once." And they said from that point on, people regarded Kim Jong-il as looking at time as not a plane, but a cube, and that he had the ability to shrink time. And my friend said to me, "Do they mean multitasking?" And they did. And according to North Korean propaganda, Kim Jong-il is the only person in North Korea who knows how to multitask. And when you have these anecdotes put forth in this manner, you realize how removed from reality. It's not that he's some magical figure. It's just like something that's just absolutely banal is being presented as some kind of major historical accomplishment. So humor is, and another example, there was an amusement park, and one of the things how North Korea claims that they're different from other totalitarian states is they have something called field guidance. Whenever you read the newspapers,
they have
field guidance.
Field guidance.
Yeah. So whenever you read their newspapers, it's whoever the current leader is. He's at the bottle factory. He's at the munitions plant. He's at the farm. He's giving them guidance on how to make these things better. And as a consequence of this, the implication is everyone in North Korea is incompetent other than the leader. So you better have him in place. But there was one story that I include in the book where there's an amusement park and it starts lightly raining, and Kim Jong-il insists on riding all the rides twice to make sure they're safe for the children and the elderly. And everyone on the platform, the dignitaries, are all crying at his courage. And it's like the guy's taking a roller coaster ride. Like, you're regarding him as the kind of like the planting the flag in Iwo Jima, but he's on this roller coaster. So this kind of contrast between something that is, fun and for kids and silly, but being presented as this great courageous moment and this guy's a hero, that absurd distance is what drives a lot of the narrative.
Did you see The Strange Death of Stalin?
Oh, that book is as close to Dear Reader The Last Days of Stalin, you mean?
The movie.
Yeah,
Did I get the title wrong?
You said Strange Death. I think it's Last Days. I thought it was Last Days of Stalin. It's by Anthony Iannucci, who made Veep as well.
No, it's the death of Stalin. We're both wrong.
The death of Stalin. We're both wrong.
We're both wrong.
That-
That's
I
probably
was so-
characterizes our whole conversation.
I was so glad that book came out after Dear Reader, because it's exactly the same tone as I used, to the point where I would be accused of stealing that movie. And that's just one moment, just how they use humor to present Stalin's air of terror. Stalin has a stroke. He's dying. He's in his own urine in his room, and the two guards are out there, and they hear this noise inside the bedroom. And one of them goes, "Should we go in there and look?" And the other guy goes, "Should we shut the fuck up?" So, but that's the thing. It's like, be quiet, head down. Stalin at this point obviously would genuinely want your assistance and would want your help, but because
but it's a little too late for that.
But maybe it wasn't. They didn't know that, right? But because these rules are in place, these rules are in place. The focus is always on fear and not speaking out of turn, even if ostensibly it could have saved the greatest man in the world.
So when I read your book and when I looked at the memes that these young guys were generating years ago, and at Me Too, and then considered the role of satire and all of that, now I'm just remembering what I told my kids when I was raising them, because I encouraged my kids to be funny. That was very highly valued in our household, to be witty. And witty and funny is really hard, because you have to push right to the edge.
Yep.
And not go over. And the closer you get to the edge and not without going over, the funnier you are, the more daring you are, because in part you show your sophisticated mastery. You're such a sophisticated master of the social dynamic that you can go right to the edge of breaking a rule and not break it. Or maybe you can break it just enough to show that it should be broken in exactly that manner. Right. And then that's really witty. That's really funny. And so there's no doubt that ability to be funny, to be satirical, to be witty is a potent manifestation of the truth. But then, with my kids, I was also watching them constantly. You can get sibling rivalries that go completely out of control in a household. And so I'd watch them teasing each other and playing with each other, and would intervene and say, look, that's not funny anymore. That's not a game. That's where it starts to deteriorate into tyranny, or deteriorates into a power game. It's like, stay on the right side of funny. You're pretending that you're being funny, but really you're being mean. Okay,
and we also see this with racist humor. A lot of times a joke can have a racial element and it's humorous, but a lot of times someone who's being a racist is just putting out feelers by saying, okay, you've accepted this joke. Can I drop the mask and you could just engage in pure hate? So humor is also using that mechanism. Well, and then it's even worse,
right? Because you're using something that really is a tool for the good, let's say humor, and you're perverting it so that you're masking something awful. So that's analogous in some sense to this corporate malfeasance that you were discussing. And so I guess the sense I get when looking at the irreverence of these young guys, essentially on 4chan, I think just bloody well make sure you stay on the right side of funny. And there's always doubt in that, and maybe there has to be, but it's still the right moral imperative. It's like, go ahead with your humor, man, but watch your tongue. Watch your tongue.
It's also the idea of clapter, where you had all these comedians going after Trump or whoever, and the audience, instead of laughing, which is a visceral reaction, would applaud. And it's like, they don't think you're funny. They're agreeing with you. It's kind of like people whose favorite kind of music is like religious music. It's like, you don't necessarily, which a lot of which is very good. A lot of Christian rock is very good. Don't get me wrong. They're very talented people. But do you like this song because you like the beat? Do you like how it makes you feel? Or do you like this song because you happen to agree with the person? These are entirely different phenomena.
Yes, well, there has to be an element of surprise in humor, right?
Yes, yes.
And that also accounts for that spontaneous laughter, which is an indication that the arrow hit its mark, right? That the target is being specified properly and precisely. And it really is a form of art to do that. And so, well, then I think I always had mixed feelings about the satirists on 4chan for exactly that reason. It's like, well, are you really watching what you're saying carefully enough? Like, hooray for your humor, hooray for your courage, all of that.
But this is like the Steven Pinkers. in any population, you're going to have a small percentage who rise above, who are quality and that whatever it is at its best. And the vast majority of people bring nothing to the table. And then there's plenty of people who actually use that mechanism to make things much worse.
Right. Well, and that's interesting as well, because it also, like, I always think, well, wouldn't it be great if there were only good restaurants? And then I think, well, wait a second, how many bad restaurants do there have to be in order for there to be one good restaurant? And the answer isn't zero. The answer is definitely some, because people have to practice and they have to make mistakes and they have to learn. And well, and so you look at 4chan too, and you can think, well, how much wretched, humorless, racist noise do you have to tolerate in order to generate something of true value? And the answer to that is, I think two. One is we don't know. That's the first answer. And so beware of clamping down on it too precipitously. But the second is, maybe that's also something that each of the people who are involved in that kind of activity should be attending to, within the confines of their own soul, so to speak. I mean, they're anonymous and it's evanescent, but that doesn't mean that you bear no moral responsibility for what you're saying.
Yes, and I think cruelty for the sake of cruelty is really a sign of weakness. It's the kid pulling the wings off of a bug, or putting tin cans on a cat's tail. It's a way for people to just feel some modicum of power over another human being. But that's a very parasitic way of looking at things, and using this other person as a means to an end. And this person might not be a great person, but really, what are you accomplishing? You're just both miserable now. There needs to be, in my view, a joyousness to what you're trying to do, and I certainly hope that permeates my work and my output.
That's a good place to stop.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this.
So far, so good.
Such an honor. Thank you. Can I ask you one? Do you have to bounce right now, or do you have time for one question?
I have time for a question.
In your absence, I've been kind of taking a lot of young men under my wing and kind of mentoring them. I saved one kid's life. When he reached out to me, he was suicidal, and now he's just kind of has bad days, which that's all you need.
That's a lot better.
That bad days if you're not a threat to your life, whatever. What advice would you have to me or to your past self when this started happening for you? Because I'm very scared of saying the wrong thing and making things worse.
There's no way you can pay too much attention.
Okay.
Like ignorant attention. Watch the person. And you do that when you're in conversation, paying attention. More attention. And you can't offer advice in some sense. You have to listen.
Okay, Yep. Let them feel heard.
But if you pay attention, your good habits will take over and you'll walk down the right course.
Okay.
So, humility and attention. That's good. Humility and attention.
And I'm sure you've seen, it's amazing how many young people just want someone to listen to them, and it's just have someone that they respect, and once that happens, they feel so validated.
Yeah, well, they really